Hi, I'm Chloe.
And I'm Bez.
And this podcast is for graduate teachers in their first 5 years.
We share our own teaching stories as well as advice and ideas we wish we'd had as graduate teachers.
Sometimes funny, sometimes horrifying, but always true.
We want you to thrive and love teaching beyond the dreaded 5-year cliff.
Hi, I'm Chloe, maths and science teacher, and the kind of teacher that would leave their name tag on without knowing in public.
Hi, I'm Bez, maths and science teacher, the sort of teacher who would put their name tag upside down and not realise.
Story time.
And boy, do I have a story.
Go on.
So this is back when I was a student and I really loved English up until year 11.
Me too.
It was in term 2 and I had an English teacher. She was very, very intelligent. There's no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. But I will never forget, and it's in my head as clear as day, I got an essay back that I thought I did decently well at, as you always do.
Subtle brag, yep.
And no, like it's just like in an exam.
Okay.
You think you do well and then you bomb it. It's one of those cases.
Oh, okay.
So anyway.
Didn't turn out.
Got this essay back and all I could see was red scribbles, things crossed out, like the entire page full of feedback. But I dare say it was like, you know, half of my writing, like the amount of feedback that she wrote would have been like,
you're like, I need
half
to start
of what
again.
I written. And the message that I took from that was
Feedback essay.
you're crap. And so I
So
gave
you
up.
felt terrible.
Yeah, I gave up on English after that because I was like, well, I clearly don't know how to write an essay after 11 years of schooling.
I'm sorry. Soul-destroying feedback.
Yeah, destroyed my confidence.
Bez, I'm guessing then that today's podcast is about
Feedback. Feedback. No.
And yeah, not the kind you get in a microphone, but the kind that you give to students and maybe the kind that you get from your colleagues as well.
Yes.
So in that instance, sounds like you got maybe a little bit too much feedback for you to handle at that point in time?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was just an overwhelming amount of feedback. And I looked at that feedback and I didn't really know what my next steps were.
Okay. And
So-
how did it make you feel? Like
Soul crushing. Like I said.
before you even read it and you got your piece of paper and you could
Oh,
just see
my heart sunk. I
red marker
remember,
everywhere.
Yeah, I remember it clear as day. I remember that feeling. I remember the room. I remember what the weather was like. I remember getting it back and my heart just absolutely sunk and I was like, apparently I can't write an essay after 11 years.
Like, I don't know what I'm doing.
But yeah, it was just more also, there was a lot of feedback into changes that I should have made or things that I needed to fix, but I didn't really know what the next steps were.
Like, how do I fix it?
Yeah, like how do I get better at this then? So I think that's something important to consider when we're providing students with feedback.
Absolutely.
As well.
Absolutely. Just curious, as a student, did you have a follow-up conversation with your teacher about that feedback that she'd left you?
No.
Or was it just like, oh, God,
Oh no, I just gave up after
I am
that.
the problem. The problem is me.
Oh, yeah.
I
I
must
just
be
gave
better.
up.
I can't write. I'm
Yeah.
just giving up.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yikes.
that was it. So I think a few things to consider when we're providing feedback is the amount of feedback,
Absolutely.
what we're sort of saying in the feedback as well, because words do matter. And then also considering the providing students with next steps, like tangible steps that they can take.
Of course.
Because otherwise, I guess, how helpful is feedback if students don't know what the next step is?
Yeah, how can you help someone to improve when you're just commenting on something that they've done that you don't think is good enough?
Oh,
Ouch, that hurts, doesn't it?
oh it does hurt.
It hurts. It hurts.
Just a little vulnerable story. Wow, I really shared my secrets.
Oh, you did. I have a little bit of a confession to make.
Yes.
I feel like I used to be the kind of teacher that probably would have written you that essay of feedback. I know, it's painful for me to say.
We've all been there.
I know, but I actually thought that when I was doing that initially that it was going to be super helpful. But you're right. I've been on the receiving end of that and it can be soul crushing. for our listeners who maybe are in the same shoes or maybe who don't know how to give effective feedback or constructive feedback, let's discuss like some tips on like, okay, well, is there a scaffold or a template or something that you can follow to help structure your feedback?
Yeah.
I know that, and this is something that primary school teachers use a lot or that you might be aware of from primary school, is that whole like idea of a feedback sandwich.
I use that a lot.
Describe to our listeners what's a feedback sandwich.
So feedback sandwich is...
Not something you can eat,
No,
but...
obviously not. It's something where you provide feedback on something that the student's done well, you provide constructive criticism, something that they could do differently in the next step, and then you end that sandwich with then another positive.
So you leave them
feedback on
feeling
that.
on a high. Like,
Yeah.
oh, I have something to work on.
You cushion it.
You cushion it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you soften the blow.
Exactly. That's what I needed.
But I think what's really important, and I know we've kind of alluded to this and touched on this a little bit, is not just saying, oh, here's something that you could do a little bit better. Or like, you know, for example, it might be like, oh, signpost your ideas at the start of your essay. You need to give a really tangible way that students can then go off and work on that.
Yes.
So it might be, you can try signposting your sentences by starting your sentences with words like duh, or giving them some sentence starters or something to go and then practice. Without doing that, you're actually just telling them, oh, work on this. And they're like, cool, I don't know how to work on that.
Oh, of course. You don't know what you don't know. So when you say start your sentence differently, how do you start it differently if that's all that you've known? Or if you're saying incorporate data in your answer, how do you? Because the student hasn't done it, so they clearly need support in that. So I think like you raise an important point. You have to model it or scaffold that for the student as well. And actually one thing that I used to really love doing, particularly with junior students as well, is if, for example, students were struggling to use data in their answers and incorporating it, I would actually pull some examples of students who wrote a response and incorporated their data really well.
Yep.
And I would project that on the board and would unpack it together. So asking the students, okay, where have they incorporated the data? What phrases have they used?
Yeah, what does it look like? Why is this a good example of this?
And then that way they can explicitly see, oh, so that's how I do it.
Yeah. Did you share whose student work it was?
Never.
Interesting.
Never.
So they kind of just had like silent admiration of themselves.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that's my work.
They were just
but
like, you
Miss-
could see them
she hasn't said
glowing.
it, but she's using me as an example in a positive way.
Yeah. No, I never
that's cute. I like that.
I never used student names,
Yeah, neither did
whether
I.
it was positive or negative. I just like to keep it anonymous.
I did something similar. I was a big advocate for really explicitly teaching my junior students how to structure their writing responses and how to build their scientific writing in my case. But you could do this with anything. You could do it with a historical essay or an English essay or any piece of writing. And I used to give them parts of a scientific report. Say it might be like, okay, this is part of a discussion and here's the context of our experiment. Here's 3 different sections of a discussion. As a class, we're going to like turn and talk. Which one do you think is the best and why? Which one do you think doesn't address the criteria as much? And I always gave them criteria and why. And I used to write these samples up myself, so I didn't use...
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I
That's a
did,
lot of
I know.
work.
But they were short snippets, so it wasn't like I was writing full paragraphs of like or whole discussions. I was just writing like portions of it. And I used to bait them a little bit. So I think with juniors, sometimes they get this idea that longer is better.
Yeah.
And they can waffle in their responses. We all love a bit of waffle. I've been a waffler in my time too. I still do it now as I speak. But like I'd give them maybe a response that was a little bit longer, but it didn't necessarily address the criteria, or something that almost addressed the criteria but wasn't quite there. And then maybe a response that was very explicit, to the point, addressed everything, and then maybe something that completely missed the mark.
Yeah.
So they kind of got that variety. It was interesting because I always used to get a variety of responses, and then we'd unpack and we'd discuss it as a class. And modelling it and showing them what good writing looks like and how to identify and know if you've done it
Yeah.
is another way of providing feedback.
Oh, absolutely.
So I think often we think about feedback being like just written, like, oh, I've marked your work, here's your feedback. Well, no, it doesn't just have to be that. You can have those follow-up discussions, follow-up activities, whole class discussions, one-on-one discussions. All of that is really important feedback that we should be giving to our students, depending on where they're at and what they need at the time.
A really important question that we haven't addressed yet is why on earth do we give feedback and what is the purpose of feedback?
Yeah. And if you look back through the literature, this is like the idea of feedback has really evolved over time to this idea of like, we just want to alter a behaviour. And whilst that's still true to some extent, it's about making sure that we're giving our students the tools to alter a response, to alter the way that they think about something. It might be knowledge-based, it could be skills-based.
Yeah.
This is where that, next steps comes in. So I think we have to reference the work of good old mate John Hattie here, don't we? Got to do a bit of a name drop.
Come on. Let's
I know.
reference him.
We got to do the whole feed up, feedback, feed forward. And I think that links in nicely with the idea of a feedback sandwich, but it also can link in really nicely with another strategy or protocol that I like to use for feedback called the TAG protocol. Have you used TAG before?
We have. We spoke about it in a couple episodes
Oh,
ago.
yeah, we did too.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm always talking about
That's
TAG.
all right. Give the audience a refresher.
I know. If you haven't used TAG, stands for tell a positive, ask a question, and give a suggestion. So, again, you're giving that, positive reinforcement to things that students have done well. Asking a question, so being a little bit curious, it might be a strategic way of giving feedback that isn't as explicit, maybe a little bit implicit, softens things a little bit, and then suggesting something. So that often leads to that like next steps. So do you want to describe for everyone, what do we mean when we say feed up?
Oh, I was going to ask you that.
Oh, okay.
That's your baby.
That's fine. It is my baby. Well, feed up is essentially the positives. You want to like go in, feed up, tell students what they're doing really well and why they've done that really well.
Okay. Can you give an example of that in a statement? I'm just sort of wondering for teachers who haven't used that before what that might look like.
Okay. So it might be that I've asked a student to analyze an image and they have to, I don't know, I'm thinking history right now, so where my brain's gone. Totally not a history teacher, but it's where my brain went. So it could be like an image analysis and they have to, I don't know, answer some questions through analysing the image and provide evidence. And in a student's response, I might say to them, you've done really well in this source analysis because you've used evidence to justify your responses.
Gotcha.
So it's not just, well done,
good job.
tick, good job, excellent. I've given you a little sticker or a stamp.
Yeah.
I've explicitly stated what the thing is that they did well and like how that links. So, providing evidence is
Of
an
how
example.
they've done it.
Yeah, how they've done it. So, that's feeding up. Like
Awesome.
You're kind of feeding their ego. That's what I like to think.
And then what about the feedback?
Feedback is it might be where you're questioning students. Have you considered, this part of the source that you might be looking at? Or did you notice this part of the image which references da-da-da?
Gotcha.
I'm just, again, making this up with my history analogy. How do you think that this might link to the year 1945?
Gotcha. So you're sort of like prompting them to consider
other things.
Yep.
But it might also be more explicit and like, hey, you haven't actually used evidence in this section. So consider how you might go back and use the source. So that's the feedback, like the things that they can improve on. But then the feed forward is, okay, how do we actually do that? Like, what are my next steps to help develop this skill or develop my knowledge in this area? So if we stick with this source analysis section, it might be, okay, I've noticed that a student isn't using evidence, or they're not using evidence from all parts of this source. So one thing that I know might be useful to this student is to go in and annotate the image before they respond to the questions so that they're familiar with all parts of that source first, so they know which bits of evidence to draw from.
Yeah.
So that can be like a little helpful tip or something that they can do next time they're approaching that task.
Cool. So it's actually providing them with something tangible, like their next step that they
Completely.
can do from your feedback part.
It's the how of the how do I get better.
Which is very important.
Yeah. The other thing we need to be aware of, and this is something that you made me think of just before when you said words actually really matter, is not only how we're giving feedback to our students in a written form, but the things that we might say, and maybe really need to be conscious of that. And look, I've had instances in my classes where students have gotten feedback and they're in their senior years and they get really upset and there's tears because maybe they haven't done as well as they thought they have. And I know having conversations with them and talking through those feelings is really important for a growth mindset. But I also remembered this example of when I was a year 11 student, and I had a similar experience to you, Bez.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was in an English class and I loved reading books, was like a very strong English student up until that point. And I remember I cried because I got a B+ on this essay. I know I had an A++ type mentality. So I got a B+ on this assessment, this essay, and I was so upset. But I also remember that before we got these essays back, our teacher went on this big spiel to our class about how there's such a big difference between an A+ and a B+. Like if you want to be, a top student, there's like all these things that you should be doing. And, the gap between those two things is actually much bigger than you think.
Oh, yikes.
And so then I got this essay back and I was like, oh, I'm a B+. Like there's actually a really big difference between me and where I want to be.
You
And I didn't, I know,
internalized
I did. I internalized it and I got really upset and I also didn't know how to get better. And I remember I was just like in tears.
Oh.
And I remember I was like, oh, I should go and talk to my teacher. My sister actually said to me, like, you should talk to her. My sister was older than me, like very good mentor. And she's like, you should go and talk to her tomorrow and ask her for some more feedback. And I remember knocking on the staff room door while all the teachers were in there for lunch. And I was like, can I please see Miss? And then I asked her for some feedback. And I remember telling her like, oh, I just don't know how I can improve. And I started crying and it was like the worst, most embarrassing thing. But she still couldn't give me some tangible next steps. And I remember just thinking it was so frustrating and like the problem is me and I'm stuck here forever and there's such a big difference between where I'm at and where I should be. And it and I know I was a very sensitive student. Mind you, most students wouldn't respond that way. But words matter, right?
I think you just highlight the importance of those next steps and those words. And I think everyone can resonate with the feeling of how frustrating it feels like when it feels like you're stuck.
Yep.
And not knowing what that next step is.
Yeah.
As well, yeah.
I'm curious to know, and look, for listeners who don't know this, Bez actually has like a bit of a background in, student well-being.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Bez has experience in crying in the car. I was like,
That too, yes.
Yes, she does.
So she can relate. How do you approach this with your students? Like, how do you make sure that you're mindful of their well-being?
I'm very big on, particularly in the senior years because there's a lot of pressure, but I also emphasize that in the junior years as well because you don't want to crush students' soul. And then I feel like everyone's been there where they've gotten a bad test or a result that they didn't expect, like you were saying, right? And it just crushes your confidence and you're like, well, that's it for me for that subject, right? It really doesn't facilitate the growth mindset. One thing that I used was providing feedback before giving the mark to students.
Okay, so like you must have the feedback before you get your like percentage grade or letter grade or
Yep. And then also just limiting, depending on like what it is. Like for example, if a student's written a response and there's 8 points that I want to make. Well, that's not useful for the student for
It's
those
too many.
8 points. Yeah.
We've got to think about cognitive load, right?
Exactly. So perhaps giving them the top 3.
Yep.
And then the priority one that I would like them to focus on that would make the most difference next time.
It's so important because it highlights that learning's a journey. And like we're not with them for just a snippet of this journey. I mean, yes, in a broader sense we are,
Yeah.
but we're in them for the whole year. And
Yes.
there's probably a few things that we can focus on, like you said, as a priority for now, and then we can focus on the other things later.
Absolutely.
Not everything is a priority.
Exactly.
Because if everything's a priority, Bez,
Then nothing's a
nothing's
priority.
a priority. Yeah, I love that.
But yeah, as a wellbeing leader, I think I just always gave students the pep talk that they're more than the number, you know, and feedback is just an opportunity. And it's also important to have the conversation with them to ask them, like, what are you going to do at this point with the feedback? You know, you can either sort of like shake your hands or throw your hands up in the air and be like, well, that's it.
Yeah.
Like I'm giving up, or take it as an opportunity as well. You know, it's really about the perception and the mindset. So I think also encouraging and reminding students that, because they can be very, very hard on themselves.
How do you get students to digest that feedback? Because you made a really excellent point earlier about, you know, the feedback is more important than the grade because that's how we progress and we improve. But getting students to really get that and to take that on board is a whole other ballgame here.
Yeah.
So what are some strategies that you had to get your students to actually unpack and then process and understand the feedback you were giving them?
Well, one thing is to ask, for example, do you agree with the
Do
feedback?
you agree with my feedback? Yeah.
Or, you know, if you've given them something that's positive, asking them like, was there something else that you felt like you did really well?
Yep.
As well. So just opening that dialogue and then also asking them, what does that mean to you?
Yep.
And what do you think your next steps are? Like what's
Okay.
one next thing that you could do?
When would you have these? I'm assuming these are discussions.
Yes.
When would you do this? Like, would this be an in-class thing? Would it be parent-teacher interviews? Would it be a mixture of times?
Good question. A mixture of times, mainly it would be in class after you provide the feedback. But of course, when you've got parent-teacher interviews, it's a really great time to have, I think, a more deeper conversation as well, because obviously, as you know, there's not enough time in the classroom to get everything done.
You know, you can have between 25 and 30 students, I don't know, depending on where you're working, getting through feedback every time you're giving something back and having those discussions is very time consuming.
Yeah.
I suppose there are other ways that you can do that too. And I know I used to get my students to write self-reflections and I'd get them to self-reflect on, okay, I want you to write down what's something that you think you did well, something you think you can improve, and what are you going to do differently next time?
Yeah.
So it's almost like they're, you know, reiterating what you've told them, but it's just making sure that they've understood that.
Yeah.
And leaving them on an opportunity to ask questions. I know sometimes students would be a little bit like, oh, I don't really understand why I got this mark for this section. They can ask you, give them the opportunity to ask.
Yes.
I feel like I didn't get that as a student, the opportunity to ask those questions as much, which means that, you know, you're going to develop better relationships with your students. They're going to be more receptive to coming to you if they are unsure about something. And they're also going to feel like they can rely on you.
Absolutely. And I think jumping off that point as well, also letting them know that, you know, this might be a lot to like there's a lot of information there. You're welcome to email me.
Yep.
You know, after you've had a bit of time, and if you have questions, feel free to email me. So it just doesn't also have to be in class or in person as well. I know some students would prefer to email their teachers rather than have that
might be a bit
conversation in
shy.
class, because it can be a pretty overwhelming conversation and hard conversation to have.
Or they might want to come and speak to you at a different time because maybe they do feel a little bit emotional about it and they don't want to get emotional in front of their peers.
Yeah.
So I think, that's really nice. Offering different ways of accessing you, as long as they understand that, like, you're only going to respond to your emails within set hours. You are
of course.
not a human robot, not going to be replying to emails at 3 a.m. in the morning.
Oh, you're going to make it very clear. We don't just live at schools. No. But apparently all the students think that.
They see you in public and they're like, oh my God.
You're alive outside of school and you have a life and you eat.
I saw you at the supermarket. What were you doing there? Getting my shopping. Like,
you eat though?
yes. All right, I have a controversial question.
Oh, love a juicy question.
I know. This is something that I've seen debated a little bit, and it's come up in a couple of different educational spaces. And that is there a place or is there space for us to give students straight praise?
What do you mean by straight praise?
So instead of always giving them constructive feedback, and this doesn't just have to be for work, it could be, I don't know, based on like classroom behaviours and things, like, you know, that in terms of the correcting the behaviour. I know we alluded to that earlier. Could you just say, okay, great job, excellent,
Ooh.
or, you know, nice work?
I don't believe in the great job, nice work sort of thing.
Or do you think that those sort of comments have to be linked to their effort?
I think it has to be linked to effort or process and a change in that. Because otherwise I feel nice work or great job is very broad.
I know they're sort of empty,
And
but
it just
there is a
also-
school of thought that kind of says, hey, sometimes it's good to do that because you're building students' motivation. And look, I don't necessarily completely agree with those statements because I am a very big advocate of praising students' effort, or if there is a behaviour change, I'm very explicit about what I am praising. Like, I really liked how you took notes while I was, you know, teaching that today, or thank you for, you know, putting your chair up at the end of the lesson. That was very kind of you, or something like that. I suppose I'm wondering whether or not, and again, I don't think we can necessarily answer this question, but is there still a motivating factor of just straight praising students?
This might be controversial, but I think absolutely yes. I am a huge advocate for building on students' strengths, you know, and I think there's absolutely a time and place for praise and just praise and not constructive criticism or feedback. So, for example, I'm just thinking of the students that I've had
Okay.
and, you know, behaviourally or even like in the classroom where they might have struggled to stay focused or they distracted other students or even like a change in their study habits.
Okay.
I think it's worthwhile to
I feel like you've just done a 180 on me, Bez.
acknowledge and praise them. No, because I said no to the nice work and great job, but I think there is
so
a time
what-
and place.
What do you mean by like?
So, for example,
Give me an
if
example.
if a student is struggling to sit down and complete their work and they're chatting with other people and it's the same friendship group that they have, and one day they've just turned to their friend and said, wait, I'm finishing off my work. Like, can I finish this off?
You're going to notice that.
Then
you're going to say something.
Heck yes, I am going to praise you for that because that is huge, the fact that you can be like, actually, I need to focus here.
How would you give that praise?
I would be like, at the end of the class, or it could be like in the middle of the class, but I would be like, Chloe, I really loved the way that you focused in class today. And in particular, I really noticed, right, that when Bobby was trying to speak to you, you said, hey, I really need to finish that off. That's fantastic.
Oh my gosh, I actually feel so seen right now. I'm like, wow, thanks, miss.
But I think it
feels good.
Yeah, it feels good. And I think if we get lost in only correcting, not the negative behaviours, or like if we get lost in correcting things, that can also be so
100%.
crushing because you don't want every interaction with a student to solely be constructive criticism.
Yeah, positive reinforcement's powerful.
Right? It is so powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think?
I
about
agree.
that?
I love me a bit of praise. I think coming back to like this whole like nice work situation, like I said, I'm more of the kind of person who's going to praise someone's effort and be really explicit, like you just were, about the things that I was doing that you thought were wonderful. And in some cases, you know, there's reasons for you to explain why. However, I'm just thinking there might be instances where you kind of celebrate something with a student and there might not be words that you express that are emphasizing their effort.
What do you mean by that?
I don't know, like I'm just imagining like sometimes you might be working with a student in class and you might be going through a bit of a feedback process where they're really, like I'm thinking of a maths classroom right now. It's just where my head is because I know historically a lot of the students that I've taught have come in and they've really disliked maths because of their previous experiences with it. And they've never felt like they're good at that subject. And maths is a very you got the answer wrong or right kind of thing. So the feedback that you get in maths can be very different. Doesn't mean that it can't be constructive and that you can't give it in the ways that we've spoken about. But I'm just imagining I've had students where in the class they've been working at a problem and they're working at it. Then maybe they've gotten stuck at a couple of different points and I've gone in and given them a couple of different considerations and they've kept working at it and then eventually they've got it and maybe they've asked me to check it and they finally got it right. And it might be like a, oh, yes, amazing, nice job, high five kind of situation. Yep. Again, if the student consents.
Yes.
But, I'm not saying, oh, fantastic, you've persevered with this. In that moment, I feel like because there's a bit of a build-up and you've been giving that previous feedback, you kind of can have these just moments of celebration and joy. And I know when I used to produce the school plays and the students would get up on stage and maybe they would just nail this one note in a song that they had been practicing forever. You kind of just want to celebrate with them and just relish in that joy and they're proud of themselves. Yep. And I think they're super relationship building.
Oh, 100%. I think in the example that you provided, that's a perfect example of there is a time and a place for great job, nice work.
But it's contextual.
Yes, it has to be contextual. You don't want to be walking around the classroom and be like, good job.
Yeah.
And it's good job for what?
Yeah. And I suppose the reason behind that is we don't want to just be creating individuals who are praise seeking.
That's me. Welcome to the generation who were praised with good job and now
we are millennials.
We are people pleasing and seek approval. Anyway, sorry, that went on to a tangent. Whoops, onto my
my psychologist. Look, I think mixture of praise and next steps and it's super complex, but I suppose we don't want to turn the next generation into us.
Of course.
How do we not do that?
Of course, but you also don't want every interaction to be you can do this better. You can do this better. Yep. There's also a time and a place to be look how much you've grown, or I'm proud of you for doing that, and that was hard, or that took guts to do. Even providing feedback as a class, I know with a lot of my students, obviously you build that relationship over the year with your class, but there's very clear moments, for example, comparing term 1 and term 3, there's that sort of trust in that relationship, and when they collectively or the majority of the students do change a particular behaviour, for example, they can walk away from their peers or they're trying different processes or, they've really working hard on that growth mindset.
Yep.
I personally think it's absolutely fine to stand in front of the class and be I've really noticed compared from the start of the year until now, X, Y, Z, this is what you've done differently.
Yeah.
And this is the impact of it. And I'm so proud of you.
Oh,
that's powerful, right?
It is powerful. There's also a place for you to develop your relationship with your students through getting feedback from them.
Yes.
And I think that's really great at forming a feedback dialogue with your class. Just to be hey, I'm not the feedback machine over here.
Yeah.
But there are also, we're all here to improve. And I know that I used to always want to improve my teaching practice.
Yeah.
And so, even when you're doing your start of year expectations, and I know we've spoken about that, what expectations do students have of me? What are things that you like that I'm doing? What would you like me to change? And then collecting that feedback from them so that you can then go and try to adjust your behaviours and then check in with them about that.
Yeah.
I think students really appreciate that, but it's 100%. So useful for our own development.
How would you get students to provide you with that feedback?
A range of modes. Sometimes we just have some open discussions if it was the kind of class I could do that with. Other times I would do anonymous, not anonymous, but it depended. Sometimes I did anonymous, again, depended on how silly my students were, but you could use a Google form or a digital platform. Otherwise, just paper slips.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you find one was you got more feedback from students with one sort of mode, or was it really the context?
I think that I liked doing things either digitally or on paper because then I could make sure I was getting a response from every student, obviously as long as it wasn't anonymous because then I don't know who submitted it. Another thing that I tried one year with a Year 9 maths class were feedback journals.
Oh.
So I purchased, and you don't have to do this, but I purchased every student a little A5 book and they were our feedback journals. And this class, I had real diverse range of abilities and really struggled with their motivation just across the board. So, and growth mindset was something I really wanted to work on with them. So what we would do at the start of a lesson is we'd do like a little class brain teaser at the beginning, and then they had the opportunity to kind of just write to me, almost like a journal.
Yeah.
So they had 5 minutes, they could just write to me, and then I'd collect them up, and every now and again I'd go through, I'd read them, and I'd write back to them. So we actually had a dialogue via text.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting because students who wouldn't say much to me in person were all of a sudden telling me a lot about themselves and how they were feeling and what they were struggling with in class and what they wanted me to help them with in these booklets.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was
powerful.
just a different way of communicating, which I thought was really interesting.
And I think you highlight a really important point in that, like I know you mentioned it earlier, but feedback doesn't just have to be verbal. It doesn't just have to be written after an assessment.
No.
There's a whole range of different ways that you can, provide feedback, but also get feedback as well. And, it's a two-way street.
Visual cues are massive. I love a visual cue. Great for behaviour management.
Yeah.
Something as simple as like a student who's off task tapping, the table.
Yeah.
Or, gesturing to your pen.
Yeah.
Gesturing to your eyes if you want them to look at you or your ears. Giving them a thumbs up if they've just changed a behaviour and it's a quiet setting.
Or I love the classic when you're talking and people are talking over you. And so you pause and go.
And make eye contact.
And then you just say, I'm going to wait here until I've got everyone's attention. And then you look at one specific student.
Or you can flip it and do the positive reinforcement and be like, such and such is paying attention and has their book open. Oh, thank you, such and such. And then all of a sudden they're all doing
They're
it.
all opening their books and they've all got their pens.
What's your favourite gesture? I have one that I want to share.
Gesture?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Like non-verbal I don't know. This is a bit
As
random.
feedback or like?
I don't know, just communication.
I just wave my hands around a lot.
I just wave my hands around.
I just love waving them and like holding them together. You can't see me right now.
But what is that saying to your class?
I don't know. I like gesturing open. I don't know. I feel like I'm just...
You're just a gestures gal.
Yeah. I wish you could see my arm gestures right now.
My favourite was always like the tap of like the side of your mouth when a student had chewing gum. I'd be like, tap, tap, side of the mouth, and they knew they had to go and put their chewing gum in the bin.
Oh, you didn't do the passive-aggressive bring the bin up to them?
I used to do that during exams because they couldn't move, and it was quite funny. But just the tap, tap, and then my students would be like, because I was like, I told them at the start of every year, I am the queen of spotting gum, so watch out.
And that was your gesture. That's all that they needed.
Yeah. So, Bez, if you were a student, again, and you were giving advice to a teacher in their first 5 years about feedback, what's one key thing you would tell them?
What a beautiful question. I feel like you're meeting my inner child and
I
healing
know.
me.
I just figured we started there, so let's end there.
Okay, I'm going to be healed after this. My feedback would be consider the amount that you're giving to a student and provide the next steps so that they know how to improve. Because I think a lot of times students are quite harsh on themselves and they will receive that feedback and it can feel very frustrating when you know what you have to improve but you don't know how to do it. So those next steps or just explicit modelling or teaching of that skill is so important because you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. What would yours be, Chloe, if you had to go back to your younger self?
Mine would be don't crush my soul.
Oh.
No, it would be please make sure that you are telling me what I'm doing well. And make sure that if I'm not doing something right, I know how to improve. And I've got the resources to improve, and that the things that you're asking me to do are within reach. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're not feeling fully stretched out.
Completely. Yes. Completely. Well, thank you for listening and tuning in, everyone, today. If you like our podcast, then please rate us.
I thought you were going to say please provide feedback.
I mean, all right, feedback too. Yeah, leave us a comment. Let us know what you're liking or what you'd like to hear from us next.
Thanks for listening.
Bye. Bye.